औज़ुबिल्लाहिमिनश्शैतानिर्रजीम क्लास 11th फिजिकल एजुकेशन ऑफलाइन क्लास है। आज का जो हमारा टॉपिक है वो है फ्रैक्चर्स। कल हमने कुछ फ्रैक्चर्स पढ़े, आज पढ़ते हैं हम और फ्रैक्चर्स। देयर आर डिफरेंट काइंड ऑफ फ्रैक्चर्स दैट वी फाउंड। Fracture means the dislocation. Fracture means any kind of crackage or breakage in the bone. Simply, if there is a crack or if there is a broken bone, if there is a breakage in bone, features are there are different types of fractures that we are found. नंबर फर्स्ट हमने पढ़ा था कल सिंपल फ्रैक्चर, कंपाउंड फ्रैक्चर, मल्टीपल फ्रैक्चर। आज जो हम पढ़ रहे हैं दैट इज द कॉम्प्लिकेटेड फ्रैक्चर। वन ऑफ द कॉम्प्लिकेटेड मीन्स इट इज अ वेरी डिफिकल्ट फ्रैक्चर that can cause so much harm to our body. Simply, complicated fracture is a fracture in which the bone is broken, and the injured bone may damage some other body parts. Sometimes if a rib is broken and the broken rib enters into our lungs, that will be called the complicated fracture. Simply it हम ऐसे भी इसको कहते हैं कि it's if the मतलब simply when the broken bone injures some delicate part of our body is said to be a complicated fracture. Means complicated fracture वो fracture होता है in which the bone is broken. Fracture means to broken, but why it's complicated? It's known as complicated fracture because when it enters into that body parts that may damage much more. Simply अगर हम ribs की बात करेंगे, chest की बात करेंगे, if some ribs are broken and the broken rib will injure the lungs, that will be called the complicated fracture. That fracture that damages the other delicate body parts or that that enters into other body parts that damage much more. Number 2 is the depressed fractures. Depressed fracture is a fracture that can be found into the area of the suckle portion, means the head portion. It is the bone of the upper body skull. It is the bone of the upper body skull. If it is depressed into, or if it is depressed, if the suckle bones are depressed into right or left, या upper body suckle bones are damaged. Means if the bones of our suckles are damaged, something right or left, means will be called the depressed fracture of the body. Depressed fracture is a fracture in which the side bone of the upper part of the skull is depressed into the broken, or is to be depressed or to be broken. Means the upper suckle part of the body bones are broken. If the body bones of our skull are broken, that will be called the depressed fracture. Number 3, that's a green stick fracture. Green stick fracture is a fracture which does not make the break of the bone, but sometimes it may the turn of a bone, it may be sometimes the bend of the bone. If the bone has been struck by something, it causes a little bit bend, it causes a little bit turn, that will be called the green stick fracture. Number 4, that is the comminuted fracture. Comminuted fracture means a fracture in which the bone is broken into more than one parts. Fracture means if there is a hairline fracture, if there is a fracture, if there is a impacted fracture, if there is a crack, if there is a breakage of our bone. But sometimes a bone is broken into more than one parts. That fracture will be called the comminuted fracture. Comminuted fracture is a fracture in which the bone is broken into more than one parts. In this fracture, example अगर हम देखेंगे, involvement of a hand into working, मतलब क्या into a environment of a hand into a working machine. Sometimes it may damage much more our fingers. Sometimes it may be broken into 2-3 parts, into 2-3 parts of a bone. The bone that will be damaged into much more parts. Something if the bone is broken into more than one parts. If there is more than one fracture in our bone, that will be called the comminuted fracture. Number 6, that is called the impacted fracture. IMPACTED. impacted fracture. ये फ्रैक्चर होता है in which the edges of a bone impacted into another one and sets there. For example, impacted fracture is a fracture in which the broken part of our bone goes right left in our body part and enters somewhere else and sets there. That will be called the impacted fracture. Impacted वो fracture होता है in which the bone bends, yeah, in which the bone is broken and it enters into the another it enters into the right or left side, yeah, it enters to the another area and sets there. That will be called the impacted fracture. These are the types of the fracture in which we have discussed the complicated fracture, depressed fracture, green stick fracture, impacted fracture. These are the parts of the fracture. इसे पहले हमने कल भी पढ़ा था. Simple, multiple, green stick fracture, simple fracture is a fracture that is simply, and complicated fracture, compound fracture is a fracture in which bone भी broken हो जाती है और muscles भी tear हो जाती है, bleeding भी होता है. Simple fracture में simply होता है, fracture होता है और bones and veins या bones and bones या मसल्स और जो ब्लीडिंग कुछ नहीं होती है, मसल्स भी ठीक होते हैं, सिंपल फ्रैक्चर हो जाता है. दैट्स द मल्टीपल फ्रैक्चर मीन्स मोर देन वन फ्रैक्चर. ओके.